And we'll have it out hopefully by, Sheena should have it finished being designed, so it should be out by July, August, and we'll do a launch in September. I've just put a bid in for the second one, which originally was about immersive art, and then I changed the title to Wet, Dry, Thick, Thin, and then colon about immersive art, because I thought it didn't sound sort of sexy, erotic enough. But now I'm wondering if we should have the Journal of the Thesis done on boredom, which I'm perfectly happy to entertain as an idea. Did anybody have thoughts about this when you were discussing it? And does anybody know what that is?
I think I guessed.
Yes, what was your guess?
Well, I thought it was the first one because I saw the reflection in the blue.
Uh-huh. So what was your guess? What did you
It's
guess?
a sexual implement.
Uh-huh.
It's
What
a
kind?
Not very feminine.
It's a spine massager.
Nope. Okay, the other title for the thesis, while you're kind of trying to think of what that thing is, was "Well, shit in my pocket and call me Derek," which I thought was completely fantastic. It was the expression I heard the other day, being up north. Although I was now told that being up north, even further up north, you could have pissed down my back and call it raining. So, anyway, do you like any of these titles so far? Or are we going to stick with Wet, Dry, Thick, Thin? Have a think about it. You don't have to be, you don't have to be pinned down at the moment.
I think shit in my pocket and call me Derek is fantastic.
It's pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, I haven't heard that one. Didn't like the one from further north, too different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
I mean,
but
how would you tell anyway? It rains all the time on there. So
Yeah, well, apparently, yeah. So, but shit in my pocket and call me Derek, I thought was just so amazing that anyone would say that, because in the American translation it was, well, blow me down. Okay, that would be the translation. But shit in my pocket and call me Derek, I just thought, wow, now there's something about identity that we need to think about. Anyway, so have a think. They are voting to give us money on the much more sanitized, thick, thin, wet, dry. So what can you do? Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I would like your responses because you are the core here. I was at this thing on your PhDs. Okay, Mark, this is obviously not going to interest you at the moment, so sorry about that. I learned a lot, actually. I'm glad I went. It was for people who are first-time supervisors. So I said, well, see, I'll be a little fly on the wall. And then I was like, wait a second, what about this? And what about that? I did learn, which I will pass around for you, that there are 7 things you need to come away with as a PhD student. Research skills and techniques, and you're to be able to demonstrate, and there's 6 of those things, like the ability to recognize and validate problems. The research environment, you have to be able to show a broad understanding of the context at the national and international levels, and anyway, there's 6 of those. Then there's research management. You have to be able to apply effective project management through the setting of your research goals, and then there's 4 of those. Personal effectiveness, you have to be able to demonstrate a willingness and ability to learn and acquire knowledge, and there's 7 of those. Communication skills, there's 5 of those. Write clearly and in a style appropriate to the purpose. Networking and team working, to be able to develop and maintain cooperative networks. Career management. Okay, so I just want to mention that because this is what we're supposed to make you become aware of as you get your PhD. Now, in reality, you will be unemployed and exploited, and not necessarily in that order. So, anyway, the second thing I want to bring your attention to is the effective supervision scenario. Now, some of this was actually quite useful. I mean, there were graphs and different graphs, but I just want you to see the 2 different graphs. Do you see these 2 different graphs? What strikes you about those 2 different graphs? They're exactly the same, yes. Okay. One is coaching phase 2 and one is coaching. Mentoring phase 1 and 2 and so on and so on. I'm only bringing this to your attention. Actually, it was quite an like I said, I wasn't kidding. It was actually quite interesting. But I just want to mention this because as all of you are PhD students, or will be imminently, you need to know the following things, and I want to make sure you know that you must know these things. Okay, so one is that you need to know in the first year the bigger picture. This was actually very helpful for anybody doing the 9R. Did you hand it in yet?
Being emailing you, I sent to you and
To sign it.
to sign it 2 weeks ago.
Oh, okay, so you haven't handed it in yet?
No.
Okay. Explore the bigger picture, and to identify milestones and research aims and objectives. Now that's the tough one, and as I mentioned, they had a discussion about whether or not you get the first chapter or the last chapter, and a lot of the supervisors then don't really read in between. I said, well, I've always found I had two types of students, possibly more at the moment, but at the moment they're really just, they fall into two kind of things. One is the type of student that is what I would call the seed student, who has a seed and it just kind of grows. The thesis grows from this thing. It's like putting crunched up thing in water and then it just grows. And so what you need from that student is a very tight sense of what their thesis is about and then how it's going to expand, how they see it expanding. And milestones for that. Mark was a perfect example of that kind of thing. Or you have a student that actually has an idea of a journey they're on, and you get a sense of where they're going with this journey. Daniel Rubenstein would be a good example of that, and he just got his PhD with no corrections except for typos. So he's another one that got a distinction, which is great. And it was a really robust defense. I sat in this corner over here while he sat here with the things, and it was the most intense PhD viva I've ever witnessed, and I was very impressed that his Israeli Mossad training came out. So
Killed them.
That's right. He did. It was just amazing, and then we partied. Yeah, no, it was really quite impressive. So those are the type of the two. But in any case, what I like to do with students, and all of you know this because I've tried it in varying degrees of success, but I haven't tried it yet with you, and you want me to do this with you, this would be fine. You come up with 7 areas that are connected to your thesis, and you figure out everything you need to know about those 7 areas. And then at the end of the 6 months, you are able to speak on all of those 6 areas and how they interrelate with each other. And that becomes your upgrade to your MPhil, to your PhD, your MPhil to PhD upgrade. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is that you are this little seed and that you're just growing, and this seed thing becomes your MPhil. Because you know the first milestone is getting that darn N9R in. And if you're full-time, you have to get it in by 6 months, and if you're part-time, you have to get it in by up to 12 months. Barnaby got to jump that phase, so did Hannah, and so did Daniel. But sadly, the rest of you are not jumping that phase. So, and it's a tough phase, that one, wouldn't you say?
Well, for me, it's horrible. I mean, it's exactly what I've not been in university for.
Great.
Marketing myself to a market which is not going to buy my product in the end. This is exactly what the right now is.
And how did you find it?
It's difficult. I'm really struggling to kind of put it together, but in some ways it's clarified in some respects exactly what I need to do. So it's been useful for me. I know it's annoying for some people, but
I think that if we can possibly look at the 9R as something that maybe is about marketing on some level, but actually should be about really what is your research about? And really, how do you formulate this question? And then with your little 7 areas, how do you kind of sort of display it around the map of the 9R? That's something you need to think through. Because at the end of the day, you have to do an upgrade to the PhD, and that is quite heavy. This is not meaning to scare you, but if you thought the 9R was difficult, the MPhil is actually the serious milestone. Yes. That's why I'm telling you this, because it occurred to me that maybe some of you don't know this. And you have to do the upgrade unless you are directly brought into the PhD scenario. And I'm not sure if you're directly in or not. I could check. It could be that you are, but I'm not sure.
No idea.
I don't think.
I completely lose track of this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not really very good at all these.
Yeah,
fonts and
but
marketing stuff.
that's why I'm trying to be really clear with you. You need to, there will probably be, for all of you in this room, an upgrade to the PhD, which means that it's a viva, and you have to present your work in an articulate and kind of intense way. And Daniel had said to me in his viva, his big PhD viva, that, well, when he did the upgrade, because at Greenwich he did the upgrade too, and in that upgrade, he wrote 2 articles that counted as the upgrade platform. You wrote,
I didn't do that.
yeah, but you had to still give like 100 pages or something like that to work.
Yeah.
So what Mark did was basically do a mini thesis, which is what I did when I was going. When I was going to wherever I was going. When I was doing my PhD, you had to do a thing called a mini thesis, which was they all believed that that was how you did a thesis. You had a little tiny dot of an idea, and it just grew like this. So this little dot became slightly in the middle, and that's what you handed in your mini thesis. At Greenwich, when you went through it, you didn't have to do a viva, but by the time that, well, had you stayed, you would have had to do a viva. Daniel had to do a viva. Hannah had to do a viva. There's various people that had to do vivas. You didn't do the viva, so you probably won't do a viva. So that means, and I will practice this with everybody, that does, you know, we'll have stages. That means that you need to know how to play squash, basically. Do you know what squash is? Does everybody know what, like being in a room about this size or slightly bigger, with a ball and a tiny racket and no helmet, and the ball gets batted back to you very quickly, like 100 miles an hour, and you need to know how to bat that ball back. That's what a viva is. You know, whatever else they tell you is all very interesting, but you need to know how to do that. And I will show you how to do that when we get to the time that you need to know. But one of the things they suggested, and it maybe it's worth doing, is that we share our 9 R's. Would you like to do that? Yeah, I mean, I think it might be interesting. Would you like to do that?
Yeah. Tear it apart probably.
I think it might be useful because yours was sent back. I mean, to do little minor corrections. What?
Yeah.
And I raised that as an issue that I thought that there should be critical friends on the panel, not critical on the panel, like accent on friends, not critical, so that people would just get over the 9R. But there does seem to be this thing where you have to like go through at least one time before you're made to go forward. So we'll practice that, but I thought it might be useful, seeing that your 9Rs are done, that we could pass that around so that everybody could.
Could you find out what I mean, I could do a Viva upgrade.
Viva.
That too. I could do it right now or tomorrow. But
Well, I say this very respectfully, but you have to have about 100 pages written.
well, that I haven't had. But so you need to tell me whether I need to do that or not.
Yeah.
Or if in fact I thought I'd already done it. The Skype interview last summer just to get here.
I know that they passed you on the 9R, so you didn't have to hand that in. That was what that was. I'm not 100%. I'm willing to make an argument that that's what
I mean,
it's about.
it does mean that if I haven't done it, or I mean, I don't have an MPhil, and nor will I get one.
It's not about,
You know,
no.
Do you see what I mean?
This is the clarification. You could, doing 100 pages is not an MPhil. Doing 100 pages, which means transfer from MPhil to PhD, when you got your letter, did it say, welcome to the PhD program or welcome to the MPhil program? MPhil
PhD
stroke,
program.
then you don't have to do it, basically.
Same with me, although I received no letter. I remember in the interview.
You had to do it again because you decided to start again with the HRC.
Yeah, so, but I was accepted. I mean, the interview, they said, what's the difference for you between the MPhil and the PhD? And I came up with someone, so,
Sadly, you don't remember it now.
and both with us.
Yeah.
And and from that on, but the whole thing was that I was coming into the PhD this time.
Yeah, but it's slightly different for the AHRC. You have to do your upgrade.
Okay, I insisted with Tanya and
I will now explain.
I never had anything official about
Right,
it.
and that's why I thought I would go around the table before we have our discussion on difference and make sure that everyone knows what's going on, because I have learned that every institution has its, let's say, weak spots. or blind spots or whatever they have. And this one is no different. They're just different ones, that's all. So everyone has to have a 9R. A 9R means that you're registered as a formal PhD student. When you're accepted into the PhD program, you get a letter saying, you're accepted in the PhD program. We love you, give us your money, basically. And then you give them your money, and then they say, now what you have to do is a 9R to prove that you actually can do this program, which is a little bit clever on their part.
So you have to have a 9R to get accepted, and then once you're accepted, you have to have a 9R.
No, you have to have, in your case, let's go very slowly here. You have to apply. That didn't happen to you. You transferred.
Right, okay.
Okay. Now, they don't actually have a transfer system here. So, in fact, they did half apply and half transfer, because technically they don't transfer students into like the second or third year. They just don't do it. I don't know why they don't do it, but anyway, they don't do it. So that's the first thing. And depending on who you speak with, or depending on who I spoke with, some people argue that it didn't even have to have an MPhil. You just went directly into PhD. That is not true. Okay, I found that out today. Okay, today is not quite 1 year. Oh no, it is 1 year. It's 1 year since I've been here. Anyway, so it's 1 year I found this out. Okay, it took me a while, but I've now found out what has to happen. So in your case, Barnaby, you transferred, and they accepted you having done the 9R, the PG cert, which is actually I'm saying the reverse order. It's PG cert, 9R, and they probably have accepted an MPhil upgrade, but that I'll have to check on.
In the PG cert, there was no mention of the upgrade.
Okay.
If you took it.
I'm just saying that this is the situation. Okay, so write it down. Okay, these are the milestones that we need to know. Okay, so the first thing is you apply for the program. You send it in to someone like myself. I look at it and go, yeah, I'll take you. We're going to have interviews. We set up the interviews. You are interviewed by 2 people. Those 2 people make a decision, and they accept you or they don't accept you. In this group, all of you will be accepted. Well, you two that are one. Okay, then the next step is that you, unless you completely blow the interview and like, I don't know what, just collapse, you know, and you start throwing up on people. I mean, even then you probably get it, you know. So, but the next step is that you then have to do a PG cert. And a PG cert, which stands for Postgraduate Certification, allows you to teach. But it doesn't allow you to teach at the university level. It only allows you to teach in some level. I'm sorry, Grace.
Is that all your hopes and dreams?
Yes, it's like internal feel. Have you just had it? Okay, thank you for doing that, Laura. Okay, so the PG cert, technically, in most places in the world of the UK, means that you can teach, but there is hopefully going to be, can you just close that off for a second?
Yeah.
We'll be back in a moment. Take a break.
Well, just sit down.
The other thing is that I commented at the beginning of the presentation report. We said seriously afterwards.
But your accent is incomprehensible by the microphone, so don't worry.
That's very kind of you, Barnaby.
Sorry, your voice is muffled due to the poor audio quality. You have, I think that you more or less have to be, if you listen in on the stream, you have to be kind of facing in that direction to be audible. Otherwise, it's indistinct if you're listening to it, so you can't hear the questions.
Oh right, okay.
And that high. So the conference, I was listening in on the live stream.
In Barbados.
No, I was in London. But you can't hear.
Oh, really? Oh, that's a shame. Okay. That's good to know, because we'll need different radio mics or something.
Yeah.
Even the question asked to the microphones were not.
Yeah.
Wow.
Not really. I mean, that they never really, they never really quite. Wait, come on, third row, you know.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of it's a half-hearted. Probably if it was properly mic'd, then it would work. But
Yeah.
somebody's just kind of vaguely wandering over there. They need
That
to get
somebody
up
was
close.
Grace. So luckily she's not.
I did wait till she left the room before I made the clean the
Just
room
kidding,
comments. Sorry. There we go. Okay, we can stop talking.
Okay.
I'll get you later.
Playback.
Right, okay. Have you figured out what that is yet?
No.
Okay.
It's not.
Because you don't know where that's been, do you? Okay, so let's begin.
That's
Shall we begin with phrases in dispute? Dear, how is it that the conversation we had, where we were abducted by aliens in the last hour and a half, how does that connect with?
The old text starts from the problem of having the ability, the possibility of voicing whatever one has to voice, whether it is grievance or joy, why not, although this is geared toward the negative. But having the possibility, the ability of saying oneself, of claiming and expressing one's identity as something that is allowed or not allowed by an external authority, the judge. So that there are other examples of those, but the point is that the trial always happens in the language of the judge and of the defendant, which is on the side of authority. So the claimant, the one that is bringing a grievance to the tribunal, always end up being a victim. Lyotard makes a difference between victim and damaged, because he can express his problem, her problem, their problem, only in terms of the language of power, and not in terms of the personal. Let's call it that for the time being.
So you're arguing that's Lyotard's argument?
No, this is where he starts from.
Okay, right.
And then he's going towards the other problem.
Do people agree that is that a fair summary?
The bringing proof of something always has to happen in the language of the authority that is judging the proof.
And do people agree with that?
This is first where he moves from.
This is his first point.
Yeah.
There's a juridical must be a juridical basis of proof.
No, the problem is that it starts from various entrances into the problem. The first one is the comment of another scholar, I can't remember the name of now, who says it's a bit of a paradoxical situation that because all the victims of the concentration camps in the gas chambers have died in the gas chamber, there is no witness that can testify that the gas chamber ever existed, therefore gas chambers do not exist. Which is paradoxical and a very strong provocation, is highly irritating as a starting point. But then when he starts developing the problem in terms of having to abide to the language of power in order to bring your own grievances to the tribunal that is administrated by power, you realize immediately that it becomes far more relevant, even if it is only an example to start from. Because it could be that there is no name yet in language for the kind of person I think I am. Therefore, there are no rules, there are no rooms, there are no whatever, and I am silenced. And the fact that I can only express my problem in terms of the ruling language, so silence is my problem. My problem is not utterable. There is no name for it. I can only accept the name of the existing language. Makes for me having to comply with the damage or reward system, and not being able to express my problem or system or value, for example. I believe that the most stereotyped example would be all the issues of subdivision of genders. There is male and female, nothing else in between. And this is a subtext here, one of many.
Okay, so let's just recap. So the idea of remaining silent, or the idea of an enforced silence, or the idea that there's the inability to speak, presupposes that speaking is essential.
Yes.
Okay. Second point.
And then, yes.
Yes.
And indeed, then it goes into a whole discussion about the difference between being able to speak and taking advantage of the right of remaining silent, and vice versa, not being allowed to speak. Although then he brings forth the fact that one can be pushed to speak or be forced not to speak, so torture and punishment. The violence and politics are immediately on the surface of this argument. Now, what I found extremely interesting is where then he moves towards Plato, which, through the method of Socratic dialogue, seems to do away with the figure of the judge, the external point, because the two parties apparently come into the arena together, and what they are concerned about is no longer giving a judgment, but agreeing upon which language to use, agreeing upon the sentence, agreeing upon what we communicate about with these sets of rules, of that set of rules, with this language. Is it English? Is it Italian? Is it mathematics? Is it art? Is it sensual? No. Agreeing upon that is what matters. However, and this is where I thought it is twice referring to what we were discussing earlier, the very fact that these dialogues are theatrically led by Socrates and practically written by Plato just conflates the judge figure onto the author. So the power has not been expunged by the issue. It is still there. And we are facing the same thing. We've got to be happy with
Okay, so let's just backtrack. So the first part of the argument is that speaking that the position around the voice, the position around orality.
I would say more that the voice, language than orality. There is a very strong emphasis on language, which in itself could be an issue. I won't get that.
Okay, I'm just trying to get everything on the table here. So you're saying
The
so to
right
make a
to
distinction
speak.
between voice and language.
Yeah.
Then.
Yes, the right to speak, the right to claim I am happy or I am sad or I want this or I don't want it, is always following the fact. Following is not the right word. Subject to the fact that that right is expressed through an existing language, which is the language of the institution or the instituted language, which in itself is the full language of power. Is it organization?
That sentence, say that sentence again so everybody's heard it.
The right to speak is always subject to the ability to express whatever one wants to say into language, which is the language, the instituted language, the language that is organizing our reality, and therefore is always already the language of power, because it is the language that is organizing and distributing reality as how we work, how we function, where we live, where we think we can go, where we don't think we can go.
So the very first point of the phrases in dispute is that one starts with the phrases in dispute.
Yeah.
One doesn't start with the phrase.
The phrase is always...
The starting point is the fact that phrases are in dispute. And they're in dispute because language, by the very fact of its being able to present itself as here, creates a power matrix, basically.
Yes.
Okay, so everybody agree to that? So we move on to the second point. Okay, so the second point then, so the first point, guys are tired, you've been having a squash game too much, and reading too quickly. Okay, but I will just continue. So the first...
Second point. That's good. First point, second point.
Parallel to this, if I can, there is an interesting book of Bruce Nauman interviews.
Yes.
Where he is loosely questioned by a sloppy interviewer probably about his political side in art. And he says that the political part of art, which I think is extremely important, is to push the limit of what is acceptable as art. It's not to stick a flag for any external thing, but is to push the limit of what is acceptable as art. That is, push...
Nauman's point is this, yeah. So
to make art claim its own territory, and not be translated into the critical language or something else.
So in that case, art is philosophy.
Of course.
Because philosophy is pretty much the only thing that ever interrogates its own, you know, body.
Yeah, this is why I like his work very much.
Okay, so the first point is that languages take on a position of power because they can do so. Because it's language that allows for a presence to come to be. Okay, but in coming to be, it always already means that there is a relationship between that which can be said and that which is silence, which is not the same thing as cannot be said.
Yes, it's different. And actually, I would say that.
Which is, pardon me, why he calls it dispute and not contradiction.
It's a violence identity. The language is a violence
on identity, but if you remember, now almost a month ago, when we were discussing the difference of Derrida, we went around a lot undecidability as the limit, and not as something that one crosses to something else. Now, what I found very interesting here is that the sentences in dispute is that from undecidability, let's say that one jumps into the arena, the theater of life, and culture, and discourses. But somehow the first that jumps, or that one that has already jumped, because there is always somebody before us, has set the dimension of this arena. So coming back from indecidability, or coming in from indecidability into the arena of language, is always fighting with an order that has already been established.
Okay. So what is the starting point is that there is an order.
There is an order that is in place.
See, I think this is where, I think this is where there's a kind of a shared concern, or rather a shared realisation with the Derrida thing, which is that there is form and order, and it's necessary to submit to that order. That order will oppress you, whether it's language or it's the tympanum, and you might as well just get over the fact that you are going to be subject to order, that order is violence, that is violent, and without submitting to that, you have no identity whatsoever. You're silence. You know, by silence, I think he means you don't exist at all. You know,
but I just want to circle back to this one word, dispute, because he's not using the word contradiction. So if we are going to use, and that's right. And what that implies is that there's not either or. Speak, don't speak. Walk, don't walk. There is you can speak, or you are forced to be silent, or you may not be able to speak, which is not the same thing as being forced to be silent. So that's where the antagonism comes in. So they're obliquely coming at each other to create this quandary. Everybody agree with this so far? Tired. Thank you, Mark. Yes, what are you going to say?
I don't know. It's a kind of discriminatory argument where you don't really want to, like quotas or something, like in bringing the job to something. You don't actually necessarily want to remain victim by the language. And there's a lot that goes on in this language as representative bonding that makes one into a kind of victim. And that's here as well. It's very much there's a power. I'm not disagreeing with, but it does actually, as you said, it does make it that there are two sides, and originally it's negotiable. But it does start with the problem of the forest, and I think it's the guy's name. So we can start with that as the event. It starts with this event.
So we start with the event, and the event is not then a phrase or a not phrase. It's this thing called the event. It's like the surface of the stool where you have the legs that keep that chair up, right? So the phrases in dispute is A, the seat of the chair, B, the whole chair, C, not the chair at all. What's the phrases in dispute? Given your argument.
If I can follow the image of the stool there.
Okay, sorry. So here's our, pretend that those are legs. So are these the phrases that create the seat around which various things hold up the seat, like this? So when we say phrases in dispute, like what comes first? in this case? Because it sounds like
No.
first
Okay,
is
I
coming.
see. Okay, he does say very clearly that what he calls the threshold and the speaker and the listener
Yeah,
are happening together with the phrase. Yes, obviously.
okay, good.
But what I'm saying when I say that it seems to me that is putting forward that one always comes into an existing order is that there are precisely this. There are original, authentic, non-alienated positions or individuals, identities that then enter into action. There are the relationships are already laid out, and that's precisely the thing that is posing. Because if a new identity starts emerging, then it has to face the fact that the world is already organized according to the previous relationships. And how to get the voice into that is the problem is tackled here. It happens on endless levels.
Okay, so that's point number one.
Mm-hmm.
So what's point number two then?
Point number two, that he makes. Well,
What follows from that then? Yes.
well, it follows. It goes through the issue of agreeing upon not the relation between the sentence and reality, but the fact that the interlocutors have to agree upon the same system of sentences. So it's no longer simply the fact of the proper and property of language, but about the agreement of that we are using the same rules of the same game, and actually goes and touches Wittgenstein for a while. And also the issue that third way in the one of the paradox of infinite regression, there has always to be a sentence that defines the whole totality, then brings in Russell and others about the theory of types. This says there is an uber language or an external language you can define, and that will never become part of the word it is defined. And that's precisely the judge. But it says the problem with that is that every time I'm defining the word I'm defining, my sentence becomes part of that word, and authority.
Your sentence as in grammatically.
Yes.
Sentence, not as in penalty.
Yeah, grammatical sentence. So this n plus 1 becomes 1, and then I have another, and 1 plus 1 becomes 1, and so forth. And Lyotard says that stopping that regression, deciding where to put a demarcation line between the word as it has been, and I am talking about, and what I'm saying about the word, is the political line, which, if it is fixed, becomes a totalitarian rule, pretending that that last sentence cannot be questioned and is not constantly growing. Which, for my research, is very important and very interesting, because then that's the present, and one stops the present from keep growing, it becomes, it is reined in by external absolute values or point of view or rules.
So the second point is then?
The second point is a control, the issue of growth and time is. And then the third point it goes to is the real discussion through it with the Plato argument, which seems to be bringing together, via Wittgenstein, seems to be bringing down to the same level the role of excluding the role of the judge and bringing the plaintiff and the defendant, or somebody who lives and works and functions inside the existing language, and the one who has new issues that are not expressible yet in that language, to the same level, for them to agree. And it goes at length in bringing up examples of the various dialogues where Socrates asks the person that is speaking with him which method of debate we want to use. A discursive one, a dialogue one, and so forth. And there I started, and this is as far as Lyotard goes, then he speaks of vengeance in the end, and I didn't repeat this time. But what I found very interesting when he gets to Plato, so my sort of started thinking autonomy from, is that although it seems that the two parts are brought down onto the same level and they have to agree upon a method of discussion, therefore there seems to be a room for the external voice to become a language, to become understandable, to have a say. Nevertheless,
And where's this external voice?
The external voice is whoever
is silenced.
is a silent voice. It's not only utters sounds, but it becomes meaningful sounds. There remains that Socrates is ruling the game inside the dialogue, but also externally Plato is writing the dialogues and controls, set up all this perfect theatrical stage of what happens there very carefully. And on the third level is that these dialogues were actually exoteric dialogues. They were meant for popularization of his thought. And they were not. He would never write his real teachings. Those were only spoken. So he is actually controlling still very much. He has conflated the role of the judge.
He, meaning Socrates.
Socrates, Plato, yes.
Right.
The role of the judge, the third absolute form of authority, which seemed to be absolute against which everybody had to comply, has been conflated with the author, the Socrates and Plato. So it isn't really brought down to the same level, if I understand it properly.
In short, there are 4 points to your argument. One is that one starts with phrases in dispute.
Mm-hmm.
So one doesn't start with the ground, but one doesn't start with a not ground.
One starts with a set of relations, or the
one starts with a set of relations, and those relations
in action, in motion, in circulation.
And that which can become a relation can become a relation because it's already entered into the game of language.
Yes,
so
it
already has an already aspect to it,
yes.
Which is that it can enter into the relations. Okay, so yes.
Except it's not just phrases. It's not just phrases. It's gestures as well. In fact, anything can be a phrase. Silence is a phrase. And then the event is the number one point.
Yes. Good. Can you elaborate on it? No. Okay. Can anybody elaborate on this thing called the event that is the sine qua non for phrases in dispute in this part of the argument? So rather than saying, see, the problem is that if you take phrases in dispute as, let's say, your ground, as it were, or your jumping off point, or anyway your focal point, it will ipso facto lead you to an argument where there's an external voice that somehow enters the fray, even though it can't enter the fray, and that can't be part of the argument. You can't have a somehow enters. It can't be.
Yeah, that's precisely the paradoxical situation that Lyotard is trying to.
But if you see it rather than phrases in dispute, if you see it instead as the event is the moment of
a new voice coming in, yes.
No, is the moment of the start, let's say, then the fact or not fact of a voice or anything coming in has an equal chance of coming in. It's not just that it somehow comes in. It's that there are other political, let's say, machinations, give that example, where that which is silenced can enter, but not because the let's say the ground has given it permission to do so, because it's power, it will never give permission. So the question is, how does the outside enter in? Answer, it's not an outside. Because if you phrase it as, if you begin to understand, that's what I was asking you, like, I thought people were tired here. Because if you think about it as phrases in dispute as the event, as opposed to this fact that there's an antagonistic relationship of structure going on.
Oh, I see what you mean, yes.
If you push it further and say it's an event, then the event is that sort of marker on a plane of immanence, or on the economy, because that's more Lyotard remark. The economy isn't like that which is left out. The economy is also a surface. So you have the surface of the event, and you have the surface of this economy. And so there becomes a moment when the event becomes enacted, becomes alive, or becomes is the wrong way of putting it. Because
in relation to Born, before you're right when I'm talking with Born, but I think it works here. It's like something started, now we're waiting for its beginning. The event. That's the start of it, and now begin from there, something like that. I don't know quite how that works.
That's interesting.
That's how I see it.
Well, let's just say that on the table right now, there's either phrases in dispute on the one hand, or this thing called the event on the other. At the moment we're sort of playing a shell game with both those words, those concepts, and that in any case is the start or a possible beginning, or anyway where we're starting. It's not like the start, but it's the way in which one begins the story, as it were, begins what's going on, because that names a power relation. But my concern is that if you look at it from the point of view of just phrases in dispute, I mean as phrases antagonistically arranged, then you can't begin to discuss how the differend speaks.
It describes, like, there are several moments where Lyotard says, what I would say that different is, and then a few paragraphs later he restates it in a different way.
22 is good,
Where?
Number
Page
22
what?
on page 13.
Sorry, paragraph?
And it's number 22 on page 13.
Can you read that
Number
aloud?
22 on page 13.
Hold on, everybody get page 13. Okay.
Yes.
The differend is the unstable state and instant of language wherein something which must be able to be put into phrases cannot yet be.
Wait, say it again. There's activity. Sorry again.
The differend is the unstable state and instant of language wherein something which must be able to be put into phrases cannot yet be. This state includes silence, which is a negative phrase, but it also calls upon phrases which are in principle possible. And this state is signalled by what one ordinarily calls a feeling. One cannot find the words, etc. A lot of searching must be done to find new rules for forming and linking phrases that are able to express the differend disclosed by the feeling, unless one wants this differend to be smothered right away in a litigation, and for the alarm sounded by the feeling to have been useless. So, what is at stake in a literature, in a philosophy, in a politics, perhaps, is to bear witness to difference by finding idioms for them.
So how do you understand that?
Well, I think that this relates to the event in terms of like its references this unstable state. So as opposed to sort of like the games, the different regimes of the phrases are like the games in existence, but then there's this other sort of like realm where suddenly those kind of bindings are inadequate for what is felt and what then has to find, you then find different rules for then making your phrase, which is then going to be able to speak that.
Did people understand what Grace, can you want to give it a go?
It's just that you can't express the feeling that you're kind of experiencing, but it's like Mark said, gestures and everything else come into that place, so you might not be able to speak it, but you can gesture it, but whether the silence is enough to kind of represent that.
But why is that called a differend then? Yes, that is what this is saying. So why would that be called a differend? What's the mileage that you get in calling this a differend? Dane, you want to give it a go?
It's sort of the lapse, the gap in between the different genres or the different.
But this gap is vacant?
No, there's something there, but it can't be expressed, not even in silence.
Good. So the silence, though it is silent, isn't silent in the sense of being vacuous. It's silent in the fact, and it's not silent in the not able to speak sense. It's silent in the fact that it can't find the words. And it can't find the words because why?
Because the folds on which the surface is folded in are not, I mean, there is more, or there is different than that because they change, but one way of folding it remains or becomes stronger, therefore everything else that is not represented. this is what I meant before. I don't mean that something comes in from outside. There is absolutely
Oh, I
no
see,
issue
right,
of outside.
sorry.
But there are parts of it that do not have access to the threshold of participation.
Okay. Yes,
And,
and that.
therefore they are not recognized
So
as
what's
an
the
invited
advantage of calling this a differend as opposed to a difference or negation or anyway? Why call it a differend?
Well, I find it quite interesting that different is a present participle. It is something that keeps on happening. And
Present how do you say this?
present participle?
Yeah, participle. It's such a great word. Like, what is that?
It's well, it's what in English is called a gerund.
Yes, yes.
But
But it's not quite.
it's not quite a gerund because it is an action repeated in time, not attributed to any person in you, I, she, you, I, you plural, us, them, he or she, and therefore it is open to be self-referred or referred to something else at the same time. And is where the English lacks the difference between the infinitive and the present participle in the way we pronounce it. That is when it becomes rich, precisely because it is both personal and impersonal in this case, and I like it very much. So the different is that the surfer is differing from on itself, by itself. It's not taking a distance. So the demarcation line is in between the organizational surface is having at the moment and all its endless other possibilities. This is why
This is excellent. So the surface, understood as a differend, you could say it's like a vibration, then. It vibrates on itself.
yes. And it becomes interesting to me when the argument that Lyotard develops about the trial, or the fact that the one has to bring proof, endless proofs, constantly added proofs about one's innocence. So somehow, although one is presumed innocent and is proved accused, there is always the issue that one is constantly guiltable.
Also guilty.
Yeah.
Or also.
Potentially guilty.
Yeah.
So
Well, one is guilty, and whether or not you get the like if you take I'm thinking of images, like photography images that are going, you take a picture, like really quickly, one of those pictures might have you going,
exactly.
this,
And
even though
you
nothing's
take that
meant by it.
on the newspaper and immediately you are
Yeah.
exactly. But it sort of plunges one. I mean, it plunged me
The perp walk.
in a terrible anguish because I realized that I am constantly vulnerable to be guilty, simply because I have constantly to prove that I'm not guilty, that I'm innocent. So these.
You personally, or
no, the reading
Oh, I see,
it made
right.
me feel that.
Right,
that
okay.
it was quite it's a
Mhm.
dark.
It's a dark text, yeah.
A dark text, and I found it's very interesting that the distances between one set of forms of one organization and the endless, literally infinite other possibilities of it, which are possible, and the different is in this case just figure of distance.
So the key word in phrases in dispute is what? Oh, it's a
It's
3-word.
dispute,
What is it? Yeah,
modern phrases in this case.
it's in. In is the
It's
key
like the
word.
comma in discourse
Because
figure.
it's like the comma discourse figure. In is the vibration, because it doesn't really mean in, and it doesn't mean on, and it doesn't mean at. It means all of those things.
Yeah, and something not in between.
Because
but,
it is talking about a relation. So phrases linked to dispute, they're linked by this in, and the in situates it in the present.
yes.
But that is a vibratory
Mhm.
thing. That's the key here. That's a very good number 22. You got any more?
Well, I looked that up last time because it is one of his key. It's in the index to first, but I remembered it because it was a good one.
But there is also another element that it is to me very important. These are all points that are one, and that there are many ways in that it takes. And it sort of starts anew the argument. when he speaks of the phrase that defines the universe and therefore has to set itself just outside the universe, but by doing that, since obviously one cannot be outside the universe, adds itself to the universe, so it's n plus 1 becoming 1, n plus 1 becoming 1, and
Can
goes.
you repeat that again, just so, because that's like the next very important point.
It's called the paradox of infinite regression.
Yes.
In logics, where if I state something, if I say the world history until now has been X, my sentence and myself pronouncing this sentence immediately falls back into the world history until now. So then I would need another sentence to define and describe the totality of what it has been, and so forth, forever.
Which is a very important point, which is, I mean, what you're saying, I want to which is why in German, or not why in German, but interestingly, in German, there is no once upon a time. There's no story that starts once upon a time. There's no phrase that goes once upon a time, because that's a very particularly English language phrase, because when you think about it, what is once on a time? That happened many times, way back when, except it's relevant to now. So the once upon a time in the storytelling, which Benjamin gets into, this whole notion of once upon a time, in English is much more graphically describing this phrases in dispute, because it creates this kind of energy moment that both holds the past, brings you into the present, and says there may be a way out, but at the moment, because of the power relations, there is no way out. It's simply this holding pattern. And this reminds me of Grace's work, in the sense that the phrases in dispute, if you thought about it, phrases and then dispute, they can never really be sides. Like in the Heideggerian move, you have A equals A, and the equal sign sets up the two sides, sets up the A belonging to A. But here you have phrases belonging to dispute. And the phrases are not the same as dispute, and they're not the opposite of dispute. There's something else going on that creates this cohesion, which is the event. And like Mark was saying, that is this thing that isn't quite able to, you can't find the words. Now to me, that is very much like the channeling of the channelers, whatever they call them, who are looking for the words that the people who are searching for those words, who can't find them, they find them. But, quote, in reality, or in some reality, those words can both be found, and when they are speaking the differend. But they normally can't be found because you'd have to believe that they could be found in order to find them, but you can't believe that they have to be found because you can't find them. They don't exist as words, and that's why you always need a channeler. You always need someone to be this vessel that brings, you always need the in happening, which is different than the equal sign here.
Please.
Well, I don't know really much. The one, number 29 is the one I find quite interesting in it, which I think I've mentioned briefly before, this way it says about science.
Can you say the page?
It's number 29.
Page.
Oh, page 16. So I suppose what it's getting at is like it's sort of breaking with the totality. So these sort of the regimes of the different regimes or games or rules of the phrases. It's like with some sort of knowledges, it's as if that can all become totality, sort of in sort of perhaps so-called scientific method.
Or what can become a totality?
Well, I think he's sort of saying that like people want to say that scientific is not a rhetoric. He sort of shows that actually it is, but it doesn't undermine something at the same time. So I
Can you read the one
29.
beforehand,
Oh, yeah.
28, because
Okay.
that's where he gets into the different types of silence, that he's refuting all those types, because the different, or to put it slightly different, the differend isn't that kind of silence. It's not a revealing and a concealing either, it's not a Heideggerian conceal reveal scenario. It's a kind of unformed form, you know, like, I can't find the words.
To establish the
28.
yeah.
Can you just say it, because other people are listening in?
To establish the reality of a referent, the false silences must be refuted, though in reverse order. There is someone to signify the referent and someone to understand the phrase that signifies it. The referent can be signified. It exists.
Okay, you got all that? Those are the 4 silences. Okay, go on.
The proof for the reality of gas chambers cannot be adduced if the rules adduced in the proof are not respected. These, could somebody else read it? Because I'm not very...
Could you read?
Yeah, do you want me to?
Yeah, just start again at 28.
To establish the reality of a referent, the 4 silences must be refuted,
A little slower.
though in reverse order. There is someone to signify the referent and someone to understand the phrase that signifies it.
2,
The referent can be signified.
3,
It exists.
4.
The proof for the reality of gas chambers cannot be adduced if the rules adducing the proof are not respected. These rules determine the universes of cognitive phrases. That is, they assign certain functions to the instances of referent, addressor, addressee, and sense. Thus, the addressor presumably seeks to obtain the addressee's agreement concerning the referent sense. The witness must explain to the addressee the signification of the expression gas chamber. When he or she has nothing to object to the explicative phrase, the addressee presumably gives his or her agreement to the addressor. One either accepts or does not accept the signification, that is, the explanation given by the addressor. If one does not accept it, one presumably proposes another explanation for the expression. When agreement is achieved, a well-formed expression becomes available. Each one can say, "We agree that a gas chamber is this or that." Only then can the existence of a reality which might suit as a referent for that expression be shown by means of a phrase in the form, "This or that is a case of a gas chamber." This phrase fills an ostensive function, which is also required by the rules of the cognitive genre.
Okay, now before we go on, two things. One is, if we change the phrase gas chamber to seance, I should read again. Just every time gas chamber shows up, seance, use seance. I actually look at it this time with the word seance, which is implying that in this thing called the seance, something's going to happen, which is medium, the spirits will come in, da da da. Now, a gas chamber, one says, does or did exist. Whether or not, the reason I'm asking you to think about the seance thing, because this is always a questionable scenario. So what he's doing here is placing something like a gas chamber, the element of torture, the element of death, blah, 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 which is clearly something that has happened, into already putting it in dispute by equating it with something that might have happened or might not have happened. And that's, you need to understand that, so that when you get to number 29, he says, is it really so in the sciences? He means, is it so in something that is considered objective?
But yeah, moving from these, the 4 silences, we are used to think, or we assume we are used to think that first we think that something exists, then that the referent, this thing that exists can be signified, then that someone else will understand the phrase we pronounce about it, and then that someone will actually pronounce the phrase, but it builds it backward, which is what is repeated several times at the beginning of the text, that reality is not a given. It is in dispute. And on page 7, paragraph 4, it somehow gives a very good key for this that we just read.
Mm-hmm.
Although these are specific paradoxical of the so
Can you just read it aloud?
phrases.
Can you say number 4? It's only because people aren't.
Number 4 on page 7.
Yeah, great.
Phrases form a physical universe if they are grasped as moving objects which form an infinite series. Infinite series, I think is what.
Yes.
The phrase referring to this universe is therefore, by hypothesis, part of that universe. It will become part of it in the following instant. If we call history the series of phrases considered in this way, physically, then the historian's phrase will become part of the universe to which it refers. The difficulty raised by historicism and dogmatism stems from this situation. The former, historicism, declared that its phrase is part of its referent, history. The latter, dogmatism, that its phrase is not part of it. In the solution of the antinomies of pure reason, in the critique of pure reason, Kant writes,
Which is Kant.
Kant writes that the question of the series resumes in itself all the conflicts that are raised by cosmological ideas. The last phrase synthesizes the preceding ones. Is it or is it not part of their set? Dogmatism answers no. Empiricism, yes. Criticism remarks that the series is never given, but only proposed. And the German is very strange here, because the synthesis is always deferred. And this is what I think is the key point. The synthesis of a reality that is never given as a given is always deferred.
Right. It's, can we hold that point and go back to number 28?
Mhm.
And we'll flip back to 4 in a second. If you're talking about, maybe seance is the wrong word, what would you call, Grace, the situation like Sally Morgan or whatever, where they're actually creating something so that it becomes, so that she kind of knows in advance what she's talking about, but everybody else has to kind of go with her on it. You know, like, so if you say gas chamber, you're going to know, unless you know nothing about history, that a gas chamber implies people come in, people get killed, people's bodies pile up, you know, this kind of thing. You're going to know that. And that's why I was trying to use the word seance, but I'm not sure if that's the right word.
I don't think there's an equivalent for a single medium. I don't know what you
Can you try reading this now with the word gas chamber exchanged for, what would be another, maybe, I don't know, something where people who see ghosts, talk to ghosts, have no problems with there being ghosts, or speaking of the dead. What would that kind of person be called?
A medium.
A medium. So if we could say, when you go to, you know, the reality of the medium's chambers.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Yeah, just 28.
wherever there's a gas chamber.
Yeah,
so
say the medium's chamber.
This is going to be more difficult. Okay, to establish the reality of a referent, the 4 silences must be refuted through, though in reverse order. There is someone to signify the referent and someone to understand the phrase that signifies it. The referent can be signified, it exists. The proof for the reality of mediums cannot be adduced if the rules adducing the proof are not respected. These rules determine the universes of cognitive phrases. That is, they assign certain functions to the instances of referent, addresser, addressee, and sense. Thus, the addresser presumably seeks to obtain the addressee's agreement concerning the referent's sense. The witness must explain to the addressee the signification of the expression, mediums. When he or she has nothing to object to the explicative phrase, the addressee presumably gives his or her agreement to the addresser. One either accepts or does not accept the signification, that is, the explanation given by the addresser. If one does not accept it, one presumably proposes another explanation for the expression. When agreement is achieved, a well-formed expression becomes available. Each one can say, "We agree that a medium is this or that." Only then can the existence of a reality which might suit as a referent for that expression be shown by means of a phrase, in the form "this or that is a medium." This phrase fills an ostensive function, which is also required by the rules of the cognitive genre.
Does that make more sense once you know that there's something that's not so obvious like a gas chamber, that you are required to give yourself over to the medium in this case? And he's saying with the gas chamber, the rub is there's gas chambers, whereas the rub with the medium is that you could say, well, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, And he's saying, what happens if we put it in the same category, the same scenario that you would put a medium, the problem of the medium? Then right away with the medium that you've got to agree with that medium, you've got to take on that definition of medium, you've got to sort of follow it through. But is that a fair assessment? I mean, because there are gas chambers.
I believe that the issue is about the limits of perception in this case, and this is why the next paragraph is about science.
Yes.
If instead of medium we speak about subatomic particles, it becomes far more evident, because we have to agree upon so many things in order to understand and agree that that signal that comes to a funny machine that does something to us.
Okay, read it with subatomic.
Then it becomes, we have to agree about all those, how to read all those signs in a certain way.
Read it. Take away gas chambers and put in subatomic.
To establish the reality of a referent, is it pronounced? Okay. To establish the reality of a referent, the four silences must be refuted, though in reverse order. There is someone to signify the referent and someone to understand the phrase that signifies it. The referent can be signified. It exists.
So those are the four silences, yes, okay. So the four things
the proof for the reality of a subatomic particle cannot be adduced if the rule adducing the proof are not respected. This rule determines the universes of cognitive phrases, that is, they assign certain function to the instances of the referent, addressor, addressee, and sense. Thus, the addressor presumably seeks to obtain the addressee's agreement concerning the referent sense. The witness must explain to the addressee the signification of the expression subatomic particle. When he or she has nothing to object to that respective phrase, the addressee presumably gives his or her agreement to the addressor. One either accepts or does not accept the signification, that is, the explanation given by the addressor. If one does not accept it, one presumably presupposes another explanation for the expression. Where agreement is achieved, a well-formed expression becomes available. Each one can say, we agree that a subatomic particle is this or that. Only then can the existence of a reality which might suit as a referent for the expression to be shown by means of a phrase, Only then can the existence of a reality which might suit as the referent for the expression to be shown by means of a phrase in the form of this or that is a subatomic particle.
Is a case.
Is a case of a subatomic particle. This phrase fills an ostensive function which is also required by the rules of the cognitive genre.
So, good. So in both of the cases of the medium and the subatomic particle, it becomes clear how this silence is working. So why does he use gas chamber? That's very provocative. What's he suggesting? Because, he's not a naysayer. He's not saying there was no such thing as gas chambers. He doesn't want to enter in the concept of doubt. Were the Jews really killed? Did they actually, or everybody was massacred in the gas chambers? Was it really just somebody's fiction? He's not trying to make like a, English Defense League argument here. So why is he putting in gas chamber here in the same way that you would fool around with the subatomic particle or the medium as a way to say Humpty Dumpty is, the word I say is as I mean it, not as it is universally defined. Why does he do that?
Sure.
Yes.
Well,
it's of course the answer is number 29, which is what?
Well, because the issue of gas chamber seems to have to reach the limit of understandability. I would say at skin level, not skin level because superficial, but at macroscopic level that we can. Is the point of, it speaks in another paragraph of the inhumanity of the concept of inhumanity. But reaching the point of that kind of destruction
we're so close.
is the event that is the folding of the disputes he's discussing.
So to just really push this point, this is a Barnaby point really, to push this point, if you use subatomic particle, you can see how things aren't quite right, and that whoever is able to kind of determine what subatomic particle means can then give the rest of the argument. Same with medium. The medium holds the power. So it's that notion of power. But with gas chamber, what you as listener, referent, witness, and existent has to step up to the plate is to acknowledge the depth to which violence is part of the silence, is part of the accepted part of the game. The game of this. So he's not trying to be, like I said, the English Defense League, it never happened, this is not what's going on. And if he had started off with a medium or with a subatomic particle, one would bring in the question of doubt, and you wouldn't be any further in the argument. Because really what the medium is doing, and really what the subatomic particle is doing, in fact, really what they're all doing, is having this profound level of violence as a core to the secret, and that's what he's getting you to get to.
Why do you use the word secret in this case?
Because maybe because it's not obvious. I don't mean secret in the kind of like trying to keep everything under wraps. I mean that it's not an obvious aspect of what is actually going on in the phrases of dispute. One might think that really what's going on, if you leave it at the subatomic particle level, is a definition that's in dispute.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what's in dispute. What's in dispute is the degrees of violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's in dispute. It's not that there's this thing called violence. There's different degrees of it. And the gas chamber version is the most powerful silencer. And not really because you have to be there in order to have said it's true, although he makes that argument, which I find stupid, the way he makes it. Because obviously if you've been killed, it's going to be tough to make the argument that you've been killed. But because the putridness of it, the smell, the ugliness of it, the ugliness of violence comes in this silence, which isn't obvious in the other examples. Although all the other examples have that as part of their examples. They all court and dance with these ugly, putrid, nasty something, which later on he will call love, of course. There's a whole other, she haven't gotten there yet, but anyway, just throw that in. So can we go to 29? Can you continue reading? Or Barnaby, why don't you read? You haven't read today yet. 29.
But is this really so in the sciences? It seems doubtful.
Okay, so he's getting into the question of method. That's why he footnotes Feuerbach.
Against method, right?
Against method, yeah. And the question around, that's the book, Against Method, and he's questioning, but is it this case? Is violence, are there degrees of violence? Are there spherical forms of violence? Are there, what is this thing violence that we're talking about, this smelly, putrid aspect? Okay, go on.
The question does not even need to be answered unless this is not so. For then, the game played with regard to the phrase in question is not scientific. This is what Lyotard affirms when he says that the game is rhetorical. But to what game does this last phrase in its turn belong? This, rather, is what should be answered. It's up to you to supply the proof that it is not so, but that it is otherwise. And this will be done according to the minimal rules for adducing a proof, number 65, or it will not be done at all. To say that it is not really so in the sciences is to set about establishing what really happens, and that can only be done according to the rules of scientific cognitives, which allow for the reality of a referent to be established. If the phrase affirming that science is really a rhetoric, is scientific, we have one of two things. Either this phrase is itself rhetorical because it is scientific, and it can bring forth the proof neither for the reality of its referent nor for the truth of its sense, or else it is declared scientific because it is not rhetorical. It is an exception, then, to what it nonetheless affirms to be universal, and it should not be said that science is rhetoric, but that some science is rhetoric.
So what is he saying there? Can you read it again? You mind reading it again?
Yeah.
Why does he, suddenly Lyotard comes in for a little bit of a lashing here. He's saying, Lyotard has gone on about the importance of rhetoric in relation to science, which is a different form of truth. And he is saying something, he's saying that actually anything that speaks of truth speaks of these degrees of violence.
Well, it speaks, the rhetoric here doesn't come up just in reference to Lyotard. It's been going on about the sophists and tribunals throughout.
Which is fantastic.
So,
Because I call Lyotard.
because it's the whole fact of convincing somebody of whatever, actually convincing somebody that what is wrong is actually right. This is what the sophists were accused of and known for as extremely good lawyers in ancient Athens. And their trade was rhetorics, the ability to speak in public and convince somebody of a deed or another. So here, the fact that science taken as the certainty is associated with rhetorics, or rhetoric, it's obviously quite a different interpretation, very provocative, or turning upside down of the understanding of certainty as an agreement, which is what we read earlier. I'm to come to agreement. But if we do not have certainty, so we have broken the property of language, the fact that a name is proper to a noun is proper to an object. So that line is broken. And then there is instead of the horizontal circulation where we agree upon the subatomic particle we read before, how to read it, how to detect it, how to describe it, and so forth. Then this agreement between two or more people, two or more participants, is one solution among many possible, because we do not have the certainty of the property any longer. Therefore, if someone is not happy with that agreement, already is squashed into having to abide to laws and rules and dimensions that one doesn't belong to.
So that squashing is one form of violence.
Yes, I agree, yeah.
But that's also not the violence that he was talking about earlier. That is a form of violence, and you're right to point out as such.
I would say that these are. It might appear here that this is a much lighter form of being squashed, or quashed, or silenced. But it is actually, it is always the violence of setting up one order and forcing everything to comply with that order. So if the order is Aryan Germany and it's silencing forever the Jewish population of Germany and Poland and Europe, that's extreme, and it is extreme because it becomes physical. But there are other layers or other levels which can be physical but not as killing, or layers that don't get to the physical but are equally restrictive. So you said before, it's all about various degrees of violence. There is as much, it is somehow, to use an old traditional distinction, it's not an issue of quality here, but of quantity. It's always violence, it doesn't say. It's just how much of it is applied somehow, between how to describe a subatomic particle and how to make somebody who's Jewish.
So in this context, what is the difference here? I mean, maybe this is too horrible to ask at this point, but why is this not Hegelian? In a Hegelian move, we know that everything is subjective, all truth is subjective. And there's always a big argument about whether or not that means science is subjective, and by science, then the argument is no, it's objective, and so on and so forth. And Hegel, will basically put forward the argument around subjectivity, by which there are different, let's say, ways into understanding subjectivity other than just being not objective. Now, Lyotard is not a Hegelian, and yet he's saying something about the relativity of this problem of Hegel.
agreeing relates to sort of putting this letter of the name in over everything.
Yes. And the unnaming then becomes the differend.
Yeah, it could be agreed otherwise. The name could be agreed otherwise, in which case we would call something else. It's like something which is just because we call it something else doesn't mean that it isn't there as it was before. So there's a sort of mapping on top of things, and so whereas the unnameable is the sort of where there's uncertainty, and so I think he's saying that I thought he was saying because science names things, it has to, because it works with the name of what's named, then it's sort of that's the sort of it's operating an exception at that level, in that it has to be rhetorical in that it's applying a name, and then it's sort of like it then sort of tries to create this totality by its regime.
Okay. Yes, that's right. I think that's right.
So sort of exposing like this prior agreement that has to go on, which is bringing the unnameable into the realm of science, where it sort of wants to sort of kind of like
Hide.
yeah.
Science wants to hide away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it an unnameable sort of temporality?
In Heidegger,
Yeah.
the notion of temporality.
In the sense that he talks about beings in their totality refusal. So like it's the all, like it's all, there's a phrase that needs to be all phrases. The all, or beings refuse themselves to be kind of like part beings. And because it's not the all, what that lends itself to is that sense of temporality all the time. Maybe another explanation would be, trying to explain it would be like the weather, keep promising to be hot, but in the all, as it were, in the totality, in the very hot, it never quite gets, so we just live with that time, temporality of the hot, which never, that's part of it. I'm trying to explain this example. I think the idea that, I think this also leads to the idea that this idea that people are in all relates to like the German word of one, a Mensch, where it's a kind of non-subjective, as a totality, it's not a totalitarian, it's almost like around one, it's the same, it's without decision, it's just that we are Mensch, we are one, we are, the words that start getting in the way for the decision, and that's what Heidegger is looking at, is the movement of time, as it were. When you get to the science, that's really, to leave with Morel's version of this one side, it's already a version of concatenation of phrases, lumping this together, the beings in their parts, as it were, in their part object, as it were. So I think that there's something like that going on with this stuff.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that
The word like Auschwitz, that's sort of, it's almost says kind of one like art poetry after Auschwitz, or it becomes a new categorical imperative. Well, that's, once again, that's not within the temporality of the writing or something, that's concatenation of phrases, part objects and such, and hence the way that this goes up the magnet, that whole singularity around which we are drawn, because the new capital imperative is like never let the door restore us, never let this ever happen again. So I'm thinking like this is about.
and that's a very good point, because the never let this happen again, the it that can never happen again is now silenced. It's the Shoah. It's the, it doesn't have, it cannot be voiced. And so there's also it's not a cycle, but there's also a movement of how something gets its voice, how something loses its voice, and in the various passages, it's got to do with some form of violence, but it's not this. It's not a categorical, universal thing called violence. It's specific to each environment, as it were, and that's what he's trying to point out. He's trying to point out that if you use these like subatomic particle, you're not going to see how it operates. It's not going to be as obvious in its operation, in its damnation.
But is he not saying the reason why I use some atomic particles and I put them
No, I thought it was correct.
in the same line, not immediately next to it, but in the same line with the gas chamber, is because the organization, the language, the rules of language that are in place are organizing everything and not allowing other organizations to emerge.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not by chance that he could have that he refers to Feyerabend. He could have referred to Thomas Kuhn.
Absolutely,
but
yeah.
this Feyerabend is the fact that it says that the method must be found inside each experiment.
Yeah.
There isn't a method that is outside and before the experiment.
Yes.
And I would push it a bit further and say that although he starts with the example of the gas chamber, which is in the past, and he speaks earlier that the paragraph I read about the historian and the dogmatist. What is very much at stake here, thinking of violence, is the violence that applies in the slicing of the present.
Mm-hmm.
Because as long as the present is not allowed to become what it will become, and it is organized according to what it has just become, there is a violence that prevents it to be what it is.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes.
That's what I want to write my thesis.
Well done. Well, it's on tape. The good news and the bad news, same news. Yes, that's excellent. Now, I'm not sure how many people got that, because that was very complex, but this kind of violence that isn't a violence that is a violence that slides around is key here. Is what's key.
Can one say, I thought of these very often, but no, I think of these often, and it's making up and doing things. And
You mean, like, in other words, the experiment comes first, then the method?
not only the experiment comes first and the method, but why I'm experimenting. Precisely because it's an experiment, it doesn't have any goal to reach. It can go in any direction. Now, this is fine, it's gratuitous, you play around with things. And already, obviously, one is already limited because it is today and not yesterday or tomorrow, and you're in this room and not here. But anyway, you play around with things, and you're not setting yourself any limits with what you have, at least. But then, as soon as you decide, or just even try to say, let's see what this looks like when I put it here. It might sound odd next to the gas chamber, but there is a violence to all the other options that have been excluded by this gesture. And violence, I mean, it's an issue. I mean, it is something that I do contemplate, and I look at it and I can't solve it. It's completely enigmatic. That the passage, this cutting, this slicing off. Now this has happened, and this cannot be reverted. And it has excluded everything else. It has given a shape. It kind of is a new fold added.
But the way in which you put it, so that the violence that he's talking about, at least in these paragraphs, is the violence of the present that has to conform to a different present, rather than the present that would have happened had there not been this silence. And I think that's quite profound.
Like perhaps when someone talks about when people are running, people like to run these days, but one talks about it in the mind says, you always want to look for what they're running away from. That there's this echo that they're running from something. Like when you make gestures, and I was thinking of the points of the gesture, it's the gesture of hands, like people screaming, people running. That somehow I think is quite important. It's not just a linguistic linguistic, we talk about it in phrases, and phrases can be anything. It's not just the language, you know, in these kind of gestures, and that will be the silent. Now, people don't usually think when they see a running race, what are they running from? But somehow, Joanna said that in this kind of language, you know, which we would understand that, you know, that we run from something or run towards something, but there's violence or danger within the gestures themselves that become
Yes, but
covered
this
over.
is like the next,
Exactly.
yes, you're right, but this is like the next sort of, not level, but the next, not even the next step, but to suggest that when a piece is moved over, so that the entire game shifts, and that's the violence.
I had, sorry
Almost
to
as if
interrupt,
the
but I had a
silent-
complete different interpretation. When you moved that onto that, and said this was my experiment to see what that looked like on that, I interpreted it that the violence was the total insistence on form, which you had curated
Yes.
by the selection of those two objects and their juxtaposition. And it wasn't
Yes.
temporal, it wasn't
That's
necessarily
right, yes,
temporal.
that's right, yeah.
Right,
But
okay.
Yeah.
it's side, but it's the same. I mean, you can see temporarily, you can see formally. I could have decided to bite these, I could have decided to take the book rather than the glass case. Any of these choices is an action that divides infinity into determination,
Right,
Mhm.
right.
Yes.
and there is irreversibility attached to it.
Mm.
Excellent, this is a good way to end the seminar. We've hit the hour, and we've covered a lot of ground. Not all of it had to do with difference, but we're gonna say something about it.
No, I was just thinking, I just read on the way up an essay by Georges Bataille called Nietzsche's Laughter.
Oh, yeah.
And it's sort of that, you said the violence of that movement, of determinacy, and the kind of like the imperative didacticism of that. It's sort of, in quite a coherent way for Bataille, it sort of maps out that and moves it on, and moves it into kind of he defines that as the possible, and then he starts to examine what the like moving across the limit from the possible to the impossible, and although he does it in a spatial way, he's talking about he talks about in terms of salvation. He also sort of explains why, bringing in Nietzsche, obviously, that there's this unlimited temporal aspect, because it's kind of like the eternal return, which is a bit like the search for the multiverse kind of.
Yeah.
But he explains why this. He kind of proposes why that this isn't restricted to, or the humanness of this gesture maps itself from the possible and the restricted and authority onto the impossible, and that in fact the limits of the human are not possible, but in fact are the impossible, which is a complicated.
Or the
term.
otherwise possible.
Yeah. I mean, it could be sort of like I'd rather, for me, I'm
Possible
kind of like
otherwise.
the infinite. The
Yeah,
infinite
yeah.
is what when he says the impossible, I kind of sort of see it as the infinite, which is a sort of shorthand way of accommodating it. But it's not long. It's quite a complicated essay.
Yes.
If I can find it online,
Yeah, that'd be great. Just send
I'll
it.
post it.
Yeah.
But it's in this book that
Yeah,
the unfinished systems of non-knowledge, which is
Yes.
which is good.
Yeah. I want to, okay, I think we're going to draw the seminar to a close unless there's any other ones. We are going to re-meet. We can get to a calendar here. Obviously, if you're in dire straits over the summer, I'm going to meet with you after middle of July. I just have to do some serious writing right now. But, okay, so classes begin on the 16th of September, sorry. So we can begin the week thereafter, which is the 23rd, unless you want to begin on the 16th. 23rd, yeah.
So it's the 23rd, not the 16th.
The week of the 23rd. Yeah. So, and I will get back with you to find out whether or not we start them on the Wednesday or the Thursday. I'll find out whether or not I can break sports rules or whatever it is that has the Wednesday. See if we can do the Wednesday, if everyone can do that, so that you can be accommodated. Yeah. If nothing else, at least we can try it for the first 10 weeks, and then when you're done with your agony.
Pass for the first time then.
So
Better pass the first
so that
time.
would be Wednesday the 25th.
Yeah, that'd be Wednesday the 25th. Or Thursday the 26th.
But definitely not the Tuesday.
Oh, definitely not the Tuesday, no. Tuesdays are not happening.
Okay.
Maybe 1 to 4. 1 is a good time, right? Because that way you can get the chief train and,
Yeah, then yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine.
good stuff. Okay, because it's the last day, I was going to take everybody for a drink, but I have to meet a student for a PhD at 4:30. So if you guys want to go for a drink, and I can join you,
We generally go to the
so
stock exchange.
the stock exchange, where's that?
Yeah, which was
Big one.
opposite to
Well,
the
Oh,
no,
right,
we're
right.
With Frank and
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, okay, I know what you mean. Okay,